So thank you all for joining us. I am going to turn it over to um, the consultants from Devereux for presenting this session. We are so grateful for you joining us today.
Great. Thank you so much, Bryn, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Laura Rutherford. I'm the director for the Center for Effective Schools at Devereux, and today I am joined with several of my colleagues to present on a project that we were running in partnership with the Montgomery County Department of Health and Human Services, in collaboration with the Mental Health Division and the Substance Abuse Division. Implementing and sustaining universal social emotional learning practices. I'm joined today by my colleagues Melody McBride-Bey from the Center for Effective Schools, um, our partner with RFA, who I'll talk about in a minute, Molly, and then Dr. Lucas, who is from the Pottsgrove School District, who's going to talk about it from a district end. So we're really excited to present today. And then you can change slides, Melody. So these are our objectives today. We really want you to understand a little bit about what strategies we had used to build that culture of social emotional wellness for both staff and students. We're going to talk about how practices that we use to support implementation across the county, and then look at learning outcomes of our project. And we can move forward. Today we have a Padlet of materials and resources for you. You can either use that QR code and take a picture, or put in your browser. You could put that bit.ly code in there. I think we'll make it available to you afterwards. This is just resources. You don't need it during the presentation, but it's something that you can refer to afterwards. So we'll make sure that we have that link posted with our slides as well. So we could do the next slide. Just a brief about all of us and our where we're coming from. The Center for Effective Schools is a consulting and research organization. Our goal is to implement evidence-based practices and help schools and other child-serving organizations through consultation, trainings, and technical assistance. And then our next slide is about Montgomery County. So I know we're presenting about a specific county within southeastern Pennsylvania. You could see it's a fairly large county with 23 school districts involved. You could see it is a rather affluent county overall, with a high percentage of parents who might have advanced degrees, and a relatively low number of students below the poverty line. And we can go over the next slide. We partnered with Research for Action, RFA, which is a Philadelphia-based education research nonprofit, and they were instrumental in doing our program evaluation. And Molly's going to talk a lot about the data after this. And then also on the next slide, we Pottsgrove School District was one of our participating districts. It is a suburban school district, as all of Montgomery County school districts are. But you could see the demographics are a little different than the county as a whole, with much more minority enrollment in their district and a much higher level of students coming from low-income families. So they're a little more diverse than the county as a larger whole. And Anne-Marie Lucas is going to talk a little bit about her experience. And then we're hoping you can do really quickly, just so we have a lot of information to share. And so instead of doing some sort of survey thing, if you can just put in the chat so we know who's here, like what your role is. Are you a school administrator? Are you a PBS coach? Are you a classroom teacher? Just to get a sense of who's here will help us kind of know who we're talking to. So as you're doing that, I'll hand it over to Melody, right? Melody, it's your turn next.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. So as you guys are still putting things in the chat, I'll progress to the agenda for today. So first, we're just going to talk a little bit about the background of social emotional learning. Many of you here today, you probably know a little bit about social emotional learning already. And then we'll dive a little bit into the strategies for enhancing SEL programming or what made this successful. And then we'll dive a little bit into the countywide implementation of SEL programming. And lastly, talk about the implementation considerations to consider as we wrap up. All right, so when we think about social emotional learning, we're working with the CASEL definition, and CASEL just stands for the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning. It's based out of Chicago, and it's a lot of research built around that with that organization. But when we're talking about SEL, we're talking about the process through which we acquire and apply knowledge, skills, and attitudes to, develop those healthy identities, manage emotions, and achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make that responsible and caring decisions. And this is the castle wheel. So the castle wheel helps us understand, what is SEL and what it's made up of. So on the right-hand side, you see the castle wheel, and you see in the middle, it has social emotional learning in the middle. And then you see those five core social emotional competencies that make up human development, which is, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, social awareness, and self-awareness. And then you see those outer rings, which make up those four key settings for school and family and community partnerships. And then at the bottom, you see kind of what makes it successful. So you see the SEL instruction and classroom climate, school culture and practices, authentic partnerships, and aligned learning opportunities. So this is kind of when we're talking about SEL, this is the language and systems that we're looking at. So now I'm going to dive a little bit into the impact of social emotional learning. So SEL promotes a lot of positive attitudes and self in others. It also, gives students those coping skills and resiliency skills, positive classroom behavior, academic achievement. It's linked to reading and math achievement. It also increases graduation rates, and it increases job satisfaction and self-efficacy. It also prevents conduct problems, aggressive behavior, emotional distress, and staff burnout. So there's a lot of, talk around what SEL is, uh, and a lot of folks have their working definition of SEL. But as far as the Committee for Children and the program that we use, Second Step, they want to be clear that, SEL is, life skills. And these are just things that we want our children to engage in to find everyday success across a variety of roles. So, everyday skills looks like, what it means to be a student, a friend, a family member, and being a teammate. So, in summary, SEL is just not for our students, but it's just human skills that make us successful in our daily life. So now I'm going to dive a little bit into some of the challenges with implementing SEL. So the biggest thing when working through this project for a number of years is time. A lot of districts, are thinking about time during the school day with other curriculum expectations, time to train teachers, and how do we support our teachers in this implementation progress, such as like observations, modeling, and feedback, and what that looks like. And then also competing district priorities for implementation, like, how do we deal with buy-in across the county for social emotional learning program? Reactive approaches are very common instead of proactive approaches, and, not focusing on quick fixes and focus on planning for prevention. So, but with all of these challenges with implementing SEL, we kind of focused on, just that prevention piece to reducing those challenging behaviors. And we have to advocate for our student needs. And on the next couple of slides, I'll talk about some of the needs of Montgomery County and why this program and why these programs are beneficial to our students. So This is just a snapshot of the Pennsylvania Youth Perception Survey from 2021. So the PACE data from 2021, back when this project was first beginning, shows us, the mental health needs of the students in Montgomery County before we started implementing the social emotional learning program. So a lot of this data dates back from 2021. And this is why, this program and these programs, are a great need within this county. So I won't dive kind of deep into the data. And if you're interested, you can always go on that the PAYS Pennsylvania website and kind of view the data in more in depth if you're just like curious about the data and the trends, your current trends up until now. So specifically to the mental health needs, we see that, back in 2021, we saw that 40% of students feel sad or depressed most days. Also, a growing percentage of students think that life is sometimes not worth it. And, a large percentage of students were affected by cyberbullying, and they thought that life wasn't worth it. And there was also a growing percentage of students that were feeling sad and that they were no longer engaging in activities that they enjoy. So these numbers were climbing, and so we saw the problem and we used the data to make intentional decisions about the type of programs we wanted to implement across Montgomery County. So here's how we plan to address this need in Montgomery County from a tiered system level approach. So we implemented many strategies, and some of the strategies are listed in that box on the right-hand side, which included, trainings for parents, teachers, SEL programming training, as well as drug and alcohol prevention supports. But we had a lot of over 12 evidence-based programs that a lot of districts could choose from. But today we're going to talk more about that second step implementation because that was the most commonly implemented across the district within the county. So even though we had so many programs that they could choose from, SEL was the most commonly used. So now I'm going to dive a little bit into the strategies we use for enhancing SEL programming. So when we're talking about supporting SEL implementation, we focused on two fidelity enhancing strategies, which was the behavior management techniques and the program specific planning and consideration. So these were the main areas we focused on. And this illustration is just a reminder of some of the training that, we get as teachers and admin. And as you can see here, it says, "Can you help me, Miss Martin?" This wasn't covered in any of my education courses. And this is just a reminder that, a lot of educational programs don't cover a lot of behavior management. It covers a lot of other factors, but behavior management is normally not covered in a lot of professional development trainings and things like that. So when we talk about behavior, we're talking about, actions we can see and count. So we're talking about, task engagement, pro-social behaviors, and academic achievement. But we spent a lot of our time focused on the antecedent. And this is just changes that happen before the behavior. So we did a lot of, building positive and supportive relationship trainings and, teaching educators about behavior expectations and rule following. How do we increase structure and effectiveness in classrooms? And how do we provide opportunities for active engagement? And how do we actively supervise our students during instruction? And then we also focused on consequences. What happens after the behavior? Do we have systems in place to continuously, encourage rule following by providing acknowledgments or incentives? And how do we encourage rule following by effectively correcting behaviors we don't want to continue? So these are some of the strategies we use to enhance SEL implementation. And again, as Laura mentioned earlier, we do have a resource Padlet where if you're curious, you can go on that Padlet and there are so many classroom management strategies that you can look through and behavior management resources to kind of go through to give you some ideas if you wanted to take it back to your own district or classroom. So next, I'm going to focus on the program-specific planning considerations to consider. So when we're thinking about supporting SEL implementation, we provided a number of things. So, scope and sequence, training and coaching, and fidelity observations. So, these were the three main core, areas we focused on to make sure implementation was successful. So, the scope and sequence, first, what we did was, we will start by selecting a program that's a good fit. And then we want to think about how, we're gathering data on student needs. So what data source are we using? Are we using school level data? Are we using paid survey data to determine the need of our school community? And then we identify what evidence-based SEL interventions would address those needs from the data. And then from that information, we want to see what program matches the need. So we also want to consider, the time constraint for implementation. Like, what's the frequency of the program? How long are the lessons? We want to make sure it fits the student population, elementary versus middle versus high school. And we also thought about, funding opportunities. How are we going to fund this program? What curriculums are needed? How many are needed? So these are some things that we had to kind of think about when planning. Also, we provided teachers with a roadmap for implementation. This was very important because a lot of times when you're starting out implementing, programs, a lot of times, folks need a roadmap. They need to know, every step of the way, are they on track? This was very important for a lot of districts and school leaders to know that they're on track and, doing things to fidelity. So we created that roadmap you see on the right-hand side. And we also created pacing calendars for teachers or folks who were implementing the program for consistency across classrooms. So as you can see here, this is an example of a second step pacing calendar where most schools started in October and then they finished off by PSSA testing by like mid-April. So, and each pacing calendar gave them like a roadmap of what lesson they should be teaching, and the follow-through activities should be completed Tuesday through Friday. And we also provided training and coaching, so formal professional development. Some districts wanted district-wide, where all the teachers came together across districts. Some wanted grade level band, so they were very unique in their approach to training. We also provided model lessons, so teachers who kind of needed to see the program, be done in their classroom setting. We would come in, a lot of our consultants will come in and do those model lessons for teachers so they felt comfortable with um, teaching the program. And then we also provided refresher trainings to districts who were already formally trained in the program, but each year just kind of wanted a refresher, and any new information that came out regarding the program, they were up to par with that. And the training format was live. So we would do live training. And we also had those pre-recorded trainings on demand for districts who wanted to train their own teachers or wanted to spearhead the trainings. And we also provided flexibility. So some districts and some schools wanted, half-day training. Some wanted just more like a 2-hour training. So we were very flexible in that approach. And also, we're very intentional about planning ahead to address challenges. This is very important because, Second Step and SEL has a lot of just language and jargon out there that many people may not understand or just take it out of context. But we want to make sure that we're clear on the language. And we also want to address key areas of the program that might be problematic for, parents, or like certain terminologies and certain curriculums. And Second Step does a great job at providing parent letters, unit letters, so that parent and teachers know ahead of time what they will be teaching, what the lesson entails. And then we also were intentional about sharing information with the community, program samples, parent handouts, et cetera. So now that brings us to our training and coaching. So certain districts and teachers requested universal instructional coaching supports. So what this did was it strengthened teachers' implementation skills, and it also strengthened teachers' classroom management skills to increase implementation in time and decrease off-task time. So another benefit of coaching is it increases the effectiveness of the program, and it also provides opportunity for objective feedback to collect data to inform training needs. So this is just a sample of the form that we use. So anytime a teacher or a district was interested in training or coaching support, this is the form that we use to kind of just keep track of, what they needed and what they needed support in. And also a resource that was pretty new this year was that our team created a Google site for each district so that they could keep track of all the second set resources, all the fidelity observations, and sort of have a place where they housed all the second set resources so that at any time, if they, needed support or needed information, it was housed in a Google site. And also, we created a Padlet of resources for districts. Each district had their own Padlet of resources where all the data was housed from previous years of program implementation, trainings. We provided virtual lesson agendas for folks that wanted to teach the program via PowerPoint. And we also had our contact information. So at any point, if they needed any type of information, they had it at their fingertips with the Google site and the Padlet of resources. And then lastly, we conducted fidelity observations. And this is how we, can kind of test out the effectiveness of the program. So what fidelity observations do is, it creates a consistency of program implementation across locations, staff programming, et cetera. And it also is intended for each classroom. Our aim for those fidelity observations was 30% of classroom implementing the program. And also, when folks talk about fidelity, we just kind of remind you it's just like a recipe. Like, how do we know that we're following the intended use of the program, right? So, and we also want to make sure that it's accessible for all students because it's a tier one support. So, this is just a sample of the fidelity observation tool that we used when we went into classrooms to conduct the fidelity observations. So that just gives you a kind of a general idea of all the programs that we kind of oversee as far as fidelity and what we check for when we're looking for how effective the program is. And that brings us to Anne Marie. I don't know, Laura, do you see any questions in the chat box at the moment? Okay, awesome.
All right. Thank you,
I'll hand
Melody.
it over to Anne Marie.
Yep. Thank you for that introduction, Melody. And I'm happy to be here today. So good morning. My name is Anne-Marie Lucas. I serve as the Director of Pupil Services in the Pottsgrove School District, and I've been in this role since 2022, so about 4 years now. And you saw on that other slide, just to give you some demographic background, there was many partners with this project. Pottsgrove, we are a rather small district in the suburbs of Montgomery County, kind of on the border of Berks County as well. We have a total operating budget, just to give you some context, of about $77.6 million. So not a lot's coming in to pay for these kind of things. So this grant opportunity and this partnership has been really instrumental in our district being able to implement with fidelity. And you heard all about the, supports that this team has provided. And it's really been great. Over the last 5 years, since it started before I began my tenure here, of getting the social emotional learning in place. So I'm going to speak over the next few slides and really just kind of give you some overarching tips from a district standpoint about how to sustain and implement your universal SEL practices, regardless of really where you are in that process, since I know everybody's in a different place. So this first slide here, and again, well, to back up a little, I want to give you a little bit more context too. So in 2021, before I was in the district, second step instruction began through this grant project. And then that was for grades K through 5. And then in 2022, grades 6 to 8 began implementing. And then in 2024, we brought in a different curriculum, not second step for SEL, but Rethink Ed. And we've been piloting and using that tool over the last few years as well. So now as we get into the slides here and the tips. So this slide here, I'm not going to read every slide to you, but this slide here is really an important first step for you. Again, regardless of where you are in the process, to gauge your larger MTSS framework and, of course, your implementation of social and emotional learning. But this applies to, academic MTSS or wherever and whatever you're implementing. So I always say you cannot know where you're going, just like on a road trip, unless you know where you started or where you're currently at. So it's not even, this is an ever evolving process, right? So using a tool like this, which, we didn't create, nor did our teammates here, this is really the MTSS framework, is important. And to have your established core teams in your buildings and at the district level as well as from an admin lens, who are meeting regularly and looking at each of these different components. So that you can build as you go and enhance where you go. And of course, make changes. There's always changes that need to be made as you look at all 8 of these different areas. All right, next slide, please. So step 2 and 3 are on this slide. Again, not going to read what's here, but I'm going to go into a little bit more depth about what they mean and what we did and give you some examples. So step 2, best practice idea, is really making sure you've identified your why and that you're using data to guide the decisions that you're making, your action planning, and again, potential resource seeking and requesting. Data speaks volumes. I can't speak enough for that. But it's not just the data itself, it's how you actually use the data to make it actionable and to get you what you need. So one of the things I heard talked about earlier is your PAYS data. Yes, your SEL data, and there is data we collect through the DESA Mini, which I'll talk about. But there is the PAYS data, Swiss data that you might have if you're doing universal screening through PBIS, attendance data, state test scores. All of these are really robust data tools, but we really need to take them and make sense of them. So an example of this recently that I want to share is in review of some of our PAYS data. Over the last few years, we developed a very robust action plan with SMART goals, and we have a targeted now 5-year action plan with our SMART goals. And with that data, and because we have action plan that's very targeted, I've been able to go to our board and say, hey, we need this. And one of the things we needed, looking at the data on the vaping usage, was a drug and alcohol counselor. And it was cut and dry, and we were able to be awarded that, even with, the minimal funds that we do have come in. So I can't stress enough, making sure you identify your need and developing that plan and using the data. Step 3 here is the communication of what you are doing with relevant stakeholders and that larger why. For the example that above that I gave about PAYS and the drug and alcohol counselor, it wasn't just that action plan, and we didn't, we developed the action plan and we had it in place, but it was important that we communicated those results to all of our different stakeholder groups. That included bringing together parents, our mental health and safety partners in the community, board members, staff, administrators, and we had meetings where we would review this information, and they were a part of the action planning and goal setting. And then we also put a video on our website to kind of compile it all. So again, that it's easily understood. Another key piece of this is I do presentations as kind of our conduit with the board 2 to 3 times a year in committee to the board on the data and the progress that we're seeing in the outcomes with second step and our DESA Mini results. So again, they're always getting a pulse check on where we're at, what we're doing, and where we want to go next, and potentially what resources that we're going to ask for as a next step. All right, next slide. So tip 4. So this goes back to ensuring there's a focus on that continued data collection and review. So in addition to implementing second step K to 8 and then the Rethink Ed 9 to 12 as the instructional resource, we also administer, and I think we're going to be talking about, if we didn't already, the 2 times a year we have that DESA Mini that we administer in grades K to 8 through the project to both assess the teacher perceptions and the growth in the outcomes of students as they participate in that program, in the programs. For 9 to 12, we use Rethink Ed, has a pre and post assessment tool built into it. So we're looking at how they're progressing and taking that data as well. I can't stress how much this is an important part of implementing SEL learning, because you really want to gauge, obviously in the end, it's all about outcomes, right? And how are your students achieving in using this tool, and what else might you need to put in place, both tier 2 and tier 3. Second to the student outcomes is the teacher perceptions. And that's, again, where the DESA Mini and those tools come in. How are the teachers feeling about it? What are barriers they're seeing? What training might additionally be needed? We gather all of that through the DESA Mini. And then we actually make sure we share those results out. So the teachers are doing the surveys and then they're getting feedback on how we're making those results actionable. As shared in the last slide, I said, we present to the board on that outcome and assessment data. So we're continually getting that support and that buy-in from a financial standpoint. All right, next slide. So finally, this is my last presentation point, and I'm not, again, going to read all this to you, but I wanted to highlight, it's not all roses here, right? Like there's going to be challenges. There's also going to be successes and celebrations. And as you can see over the last 5 years, we've had some challenges, and probably none of it's much of it's probably familiar to all of you. Biggest things is time, like where are we going to fit this in? How does it build into our larger PD calendar? What do the fidelity checks look like? Who's going to do them and when? This partnership is great because we have these team members from Devereux and the Center for Effective Schools coming in and helping us with that. The other huge piece, just to pull away some challenges, is funding. I've explained and talked about how communicating and making sure everybody's aware of what you're doing to support these initiatives and having action plans and goals is key so that you can get the financial backing when, this grant's going to run out, when we need to purchase on our own the second step materials, the PD, the DESA Mini. So it's always making sure you're including those relevant stakeholder. For the celebrations and successes, I just want to highlight overall the most important outcome, obviously, is always how are the students achieving? What's the growth indicators that we're seeing? Over the last 5 years of looking at this data, and for me, the last 4 years I'm presenting on it, I can share pre and post results always show growth and positive gains in our students. Doesn't mean that we're, there's always work to be done and tier 2 and tier 3 things to look at. But as we gain momentum and as we look at that, it's an important piece. I'm also going to, and I don't know if it's fully on this slide, but it's really, we have amazing team members that I work with, might even be in this presentation listening today, both at the building level, our building coaches for PBIS, and I have an amazing coordinator of special services, Becky Papano, I want to give a shout out to. She's been instrumental working alongside me to help us with the sustaining effort. So it's really important you have those key people working with you alongside you because you really, really can't do this work alone. And I think that's it for me on these slides. Thanks for the opportunity. And the only other thing I wanted to share is this is a lot in a little bit of time, and I went fast. At the end, you will see my contact information is there. Please reach out. Always willing to help and support and go from there. Thank you. And I will hand it over to, I'm not sure who I'm handing it over to, but
I'm
next
jumping
slide.
in. And you were so much speaking my language. Thank you so much for talking about how important data is and how much you use it and communicate it and everything. So I'm ready to share some of that. So we talked about this background on social emotional learning. We talked about the strategies for enhancing programming and actually implementing it in your districts. I'm Molly Pileggi with Research for Action, and we're now going to look at some of those outcomes from the countywide implementation that Anne Marie was just singing the praises of. So let's have a look. So like Melody set us up in the beginning, and we've been talking about, our focus for this presentation is the second step implementation, which was implemented in 11 partnering school districts over the past 4 years and currently in year 5. So we're going to look at some of this information. And like Anne Marie previewed, on the next slide, we'll talk about what we were doing in this evaluation and how we wound up gathering data for it. So if you want to jump forward, Melody. So we did electronic data collection. This is a screenshot of the survey that the teachers would be going in to see. And we were gathering data in order to, one, like Anne Marie said, most important, determine if the current programming was meeting the needs of the students. To evaluate areas for growth or for future implementation and sustain that implementation motivation, seeing that data, seeing that change over time, being able to improve, change, tweak, and continue. So that was kind of our motivation for gathering this data. On the next slide, I'll talk about how we then, what instruments we use to collect it. So you can go ahead forward. So as Anne Marie previewed, we had 2 surveys that we were using. So it was bundled into one, so it felt like one survey to a teacher, but it was really 2 components. First, we used the DESA Mini, and so that's a 8-question survey asking teachers to reflect on their students' behavior in the classroom and asking them how frequently they're displaying 8 positive behaviors. And as Emery was saying, we do that as a pre-survey before implementing the curriculum each year, and a post-survey towards the end of the year, and then look at differences to look how much did students change over the course of the year in the behaviors they're showing in their classrooms. So that was really determining, is this programming meeting the needs of students from one perspective? And we also had this implementation survey that was embedded in where we were getting the teachers' perceptions of how much it was benefiting their students. And so we'll talk through both of those today And we also asked the teachers more things about like, did they feel prepared? Did they feel supported? Were there ways that we should make changes to improve implementation in the future? So 2 different survey components bundled together that we administered to teachers of students where second step was being implemented. You can go ahead to the next slide. So let's look into some of this data. So first we'll look at those DESA mini scores. So again, that was that 8-question survey and asking teachers how frequently each individual student in their classroom is displaying these positive behaviors in their classroom. And each of those individual would be on a scale of a 5-point scale, and you add them all up to get a total score of the DESA mini. So the range would be 0, meaning they never display any of these, to 32. They're very frequently displaying all of them. And you can see that each of these pairs of bars is for 1 school year over the past 4, and the pre-survey in the maroonish color to the post-survey in the tealish color. So you see steady growth in every year among elementary school students. The exact numbers varied from year to year, and the averages kind of were a little bit different, but we saw steady improvements and statistically significant improvements in every year among elementary school students. The next slide then breaks out for middle school students, where we didn't see as consistent improvements. It's also a much smaller sample size. We had more than 12,000 students in each year on the elementary side versus around 1,000 to 3,000 on the middle school implementers. So a different scale that we're looking at. And you may notice that like these averages were a little higher than the elementary school students. Some of these middle school students may have seen similar content or had other ways to develop these skills. So started a little bit higher. We saw growth in some of the years, but it was much less significant than what we saw in the elementary levels. And in some years, we saw no real change in those averages. Not to say individual students didn't grow or change, but overall, on average across the county, we didn't see as much of a difference for middle school students in these DESA scores. You can go ahead to the next slide. Another way to look at the DESA scores, which we did here, was breaking down, instead of just looking at that average, the DESA gives suggestions of where you can cut off that 0 to 32 scale. What numbers relate to like having strength in social emotional capacities? What are like a typical capacity, and what would be a score that means that student needs some more supports? And so here we see again that over the past 4 years among elementary school students, a column for the pre-survey and then right alongside it a column for the post-survey. And so if you focus just on the strength, we see every year across here, the pre-survey, about 20% of students demonstrated strength in their capacities at the pre-survey, and then almost 40% did at the post-survey. So substantial growth, almost doubling the percentage of students who were showing that strength in capacities from pre to post. And also a change with the percentage of students needing to improve decreasing pre to post every year. Again, that was for elementary school. And the next slide has the same data for middle schools. And as we saw in the average scores, the changes here are not as substantial as what we see in the elementary school, but we do still see some growth in the percentage of students who particularly were demonstrating strength in their social emotional capacity pre to post at the middle school level. So little growths in each of those kind of teal bars from pre to post each year. So I think I have one more slide about the DESA mini scores. And so we're kind of seeing, we saw in the earlier graphs every year kind of this gain each year, but there was a question that came up as we were working with districts a year ago, thinking about like, but what does that mean after students have had multiple years of this? So in the last year that we did these analyses, we decided to try to look only at cohorts of students who received second step for multiple years. We didn't have a good way to like know exactly each individual student who was receiving it multiple years, but at least looking at not adding the new kindergartners each year, but looking at the kindergartners in 2023 who were then in first graders in 23-24 and second graders in 24-25, and watching over time how the capacity of those cohorts of students changed as they received second step programming for multiple years. And so here I'm looking at the same statistic we had from the last slide, where it's just the percentage of students demonstrating need. So that like lowermost square on the previous slides. And we see a similar kind of up and down pattern where pre-survey with the circles, there were more students demonstrating need, and post-survey, there were fewer students. Each year, this up and down movement. And at the county level, this data looked looks pretty flat year over year. If you look like just at the post survey, it's around 8% every year. At the district level, we saw some interesting more like skew where it did look like over time, cohorts of students were, there were fewer and fewer who were demonstrating need, and that post survey was like declining down. So interesting that like once you look across the county, we weren't seeing that, but we did look at things at the district and saw some really promising patterns for this change over time. So this is another analysis that we plan to do again this year. It was great feedback from the districts we work with that this would be of interest and something we're going to keep an eye on as we go forward. The next, I want to talk about some of those teacher perceptions. We said that the instruments were the decimini, which is that student behavior, and then what did the teachers themselves feel? And so this is specifically asking the teachers how they perceive the benefits of second steps for their students, not reflecting on what they're seeing in their students, but just broadly. And we saw across the board, most teachers really felt that the second step curriculum helped their students practice empathy and kindness, manage emotions, and solve problems, with 80% or more of teachers agreeing on that those three skills were things the second step helped their students with. The results were more mixed for the others, as you see in this slide, where around a little more than 2/3 of teachers felt that the curriculum helped their students set goals for themselves. And then the final two at the bottom are questions only asked of the middle school teachers, since the curriculum only focuses on that in the middle school. And around half of those middle school teachers felt that second step helped their students practice responsible decision making or navigate peer pressure. So lots of positives here with some mixed as we get kind of into the more upper grades materials. We also asked the teachers how they perceive like their ability to implement second step. And here we saw most teachers felt like they had positive perceptions of the curriculum in terms of its usability, being easy to implement, offering useful strategies, its value, and its alignment with fitting with the school priorities and with students' needs, and even being worth time to implement. And we know that that's always a challenge in the classroom where time is always limited. So some really positive responses here from teachers. And finally, I have one about the supports and the things that teachers needed to be able to implement second step. And so we see that nearly all teachers said that they had the materials they needed through the work we did together. Most teachers also felt like there was someone at their school they could ask for help if they needed it in implementing the programming. And then perceptions were a little more mixed when it came to principal and administrative oversight and active participation. This was something that came up frequently in our meetings. We meet with the districts to look at the pre-survey and to talk about the year-long data collection every year. And so this was always kind of something that would come up in the conversation, that would be something where we'd use that for continuous improvement to think about like, all right, if this is kind of the low part, what can be changed in implementation next year? How can we improve in that? And we saw steady growth in many of these measures over time, as we saw our districts really taking that data seriously to figure out how to improve and better support teachers in implementing their programming. I think I have one more slide. Just kind of echoing Anne Marie and her communication about needing to communicate this data out. So like I said, we would meet with districts and we would twice a year with the pre-survey and with the post-survey and talk through the findings. Each district would get a report on their own data from their own district, and that would include some comparisons to the county level data so they could see kind of how they were similar or different from county-wide, and a county level report. And the county themselves also would take that data and communicate it out as well, talking about the data to talk about what is happening and how it is helping students, as Anne-Marie said, is critical to make sure that this information is known and that we can make the case for continuing this work in the future. So I think with that, I'll pass back to
Me. It's
All
me. Okay, great.
Great.
So now I'm just gonna go over some broad, big picture implementation considerations and the wrap up as we go through. So I think there's a couple of things if you're thinking about implementing any SEL type of curriculum or having thoughts about it. We know that in this climate that we're in right now, that you might need some advocacy to get buy-in from everybody here. So you might need to help make sure that you're working with the right people to advocate for this work. So, building partnerships and making sure you're talking to the right people in your district about the needs. I think it would be really advantageous to go to school board meetings and have them hear what you have to say, talk to parents at PTA or PTO meetings, sort of get a sense of what people's understanding about SEL is, and focusing on those sorts of um, you know, maybe misperceptions or misunderstanding about it. Similarly talking about what Melody talked about, like these human skills, that we're trying to build things in students to make sure they're successful in life. Um, Also making sure that we're making that there's something in there about action planning, and then of course advocating at the systems level. Implementation can't happen without system supports. And so for advocacy purposes, that's a big part. As you just heard Molly talk about, an issue that came up was administrator supports, the perception, at least of teachers, is that they weren't getting as much administrative support as maybe we had hoped. And so this is something that 100% needs admin support, both at the district level administration and also at the school level. So in order to do that, we recommend that you have meetings regularly with upper level administration to kind of talk about how it's going and problem solve. Um, uh, a lot of the tools that Melody had shared is very, very helpful to share with administrative to help with communication and transparency. So helping them support them with Google Sites like that, what we're using now to support everything in one place and have the resources all there, scheduling an email. And then one thing that could be very helpful is to get everyone together across districts to kind of talk and problem solve together. I think that's just generally a good strategy for any large scale implementation, meeting with other districts who are doing it successfully and talking about what did you do to make this work. And I feel like we do that here in this kind of forum where we hear from people from all over the state kind of talking about their experience in this kind of setting. And hopefully this is something that could be replicated maybe even within county level districts or within partnerships within IUs and things like that, to have that opportunity to have that conversation about what went well or what lessons learned or those sorts of things. One of the most important things, and I think as for many of you, you probably already know this, is that this is not something you could just pick up second step today and and be like, we're going to implement it in March. We really need to make sure there's careful planning, that there's a lot of time to think about it. And so we would say, if you're thinking about this, this is not something that you would be like, let's do this plan it over the summer and start it in the fall. I would give yourself like a good year to kind of think about how to get this implemented, because the more planning you do and the more purposeful you are, the more likely you are to be successful. We also recommend potentially piloting the program with either a few staff to build buy-in and kind of work out the kinks. So it could be you're going to pilot it in first grade, or you're going to pilot it with, volunteer staff across grades, or however you want to do it, or in one school in the district. It could be really helpful and then check in on feedback and how it's going and what are things that are working, what they're not, before you roll it out district-wide where it might be a heavier lift. All right, next slide. So we also want to make sure that we're not just doing a program and then it goes away. So we want to make sure that we're just building that sustainability. So again, using that clarification about language that Melody talked about. Looking at data and sharing about student need and saying, looking at your PACE data and seeing what the needs are and making sure it's going back to those sorts of things. Or if you have universal screening and you're seeing data about need, that's something you can incorporate into that. As we know, and why we're all here, is it's great to integrate SEL into an MTSS system. So you're talking about it at like the tier 1, 2, 3 level. Second Step now has a lot of new great resources for tier two groups. So that was a great kind of idea to think about how you can incorporate that into your larger MTSS program. If at tier one you have it happening for everyone, and then maybe you have some supports for some kids at the tier two level as part of your MTSS program where you're looking at data and making decisions. We really believe that these ongoing implementation supports are really important and then continuing to follow through with them from year to year, all the things that kind of Melody talked about. I think a plan for fidelity of implementation is important. We understand that if you're not in a grant, you probably can't have somebody from the outside come in and check on your fidelity. If 30% of your staff who are implementing, that's just not reasonable. But there are other ways to look at fidelity and think about it. You can use your district resources, your school resources to kind of do sort of fidelity checks. You can have ways of thinking about fidelity in terms of self-reports or self-reflections and or some are looking at your, dashboard if like you are using a program like Second Step. So we really recommend you think about through and you think about how you're going to consider fidelity if you don't have the ability to go in and do regular classroom observations of lessons. And then I know we've mentioned this, Anne-Marie mentioned it, and Molly mentioned it, but really sharing data and outcomes with largely with your district, with the school board, with parents, really knowing like what's happening and what's going on, because there is a cost for all of these things in terms of both money and time, and we have to make sure we're using that wisely, and we don't want things to be cut because people aren't aware, right, that of the impact. So we want to make sure that we're communicating all of our progress and all of our outcomes with all of our key stakeholders as we're implementing.